Okay, so just a brief word of introduction and what I've got in mind today, and then the interest is going to evolve out. So I'm Mike. I've been here 8 years, and before I came here, I used to teach a world religions class at Bishop's High School in La Jolla. This is a class that they require for their 8th graders to take. And normally I do it over a semester, but I was a summer teacher, so I crammed essentially a semester into 3 weeks with kids that were paying at the time $30,000 a year to go to middle school. So this is like a nationally ranked school, and it was a super interesting thing that they were doing. It was required from all of their students to learn world religions and to learn them from a slightly affirmative perspective. That was new for me, because the churches that I had grown up in, we had books called like Kingdom of the Cults, or Why Catholics Are Wrong, or like you just fill in the blank, right? And I had taught at another school for about 3 years, and they did teach world religions, but they taught them very critically, like Muslims believe X, and here's why they're wrong, and here's how that's like Satan's fingers in the brains of a sixth of the world population. So my suspicion is you probably already know enough suspicious stuff about other folks that makes it less likely you want to learn about them. So I don't want to take that approach. What I would like to do, based a little bit out of my experience at the Bishop School, and since then, I've had a number of interactions that I think are really important, is have some appreciation for what other people are doing. Not necessarily, I'm not interested in converting you. I'm not interested in converting you at all, but I do think I am interested in converting how we approach people who look and behave and worship differently from us, so that we can say, that isn't for me, but I get what that's doing for you. I hope that makes sense. So that's what I want to do at the beginning. And I'm going to tell you, if I was going to teach you Christianity in this course, I'd probably be the harshest on it. Because, I mean, we got lots of problems, and we tend to be critical of what we know the most. So here's what I wanted to do today, is start out talking about how I want maybe to structure this. And I have this handout we don't need today. I made it really obnoxiously big because it turns out all the research I'm familiar with says that the best way to retain information is to put it in a grid. So what I've laid out, and we'll do this as we go through, we're not going to cover a world religion in a week. That just would be unfair. We'll spend as much time as we're interested in, and then we'll move on, right? But I started with Judaism, and we may say, well, we'll do Christianity later. That's fine. Islam, and I have Hinduism and Buddhism, and Hinduism's a misnomer, but we'll talk about that when we get there. And then I left the back blank, but I can easily reproduce this. I can't make it any bigger. The good news is it does fold into a regular sheet of paper, and the grid has some of the ways I want to do it. So I've given you that visual aid and approach, and now let's kind of talk about the method I want to try to use when we go through at least the first 5. Okay, so first, here's a little bit of religious geography. And it's an interesting thing that most times we do surveys, we do split Catholicism from Protestant, from Orthodox, and other Christians. I mean, it's like not a really comfortable thing in surveys for some reason for people to just say, here's the segment that's Christian, right? You can do the addition here, and clearly Christianity in some form, right, is the biggest global faith identity that there is. Right, and this is ever changing. See, you've seen this in 2002. I would tell you that blue segment is probably encroached quite a bit in this area here, right? I mean, Islam is growing worldwide, and it's growing in the United States as well.
Hello.
Hey there.
Good morning, Tony. How are you doing?
We're doing great. If you would
Oh, I'm doing fine.
Yeah, if Teresa, I'm going to hit mute on you because I'm hearing background noise.
No, I just fell on the bank side of the pool. I got scared sitting up on that ladder. It's too tall.
Okay.
No, I finally got fixed.
I thought you was talking.
Almost all summer.
That's how we do that right there. Okay. Hey, this happens all the time, you know. Happens to me. Phones ring. That's that. Okay. So like I mentioned, you start seeing blue, and if you know about this in the States, you'd see some big blue areas up there in Michigan now, right? And I don't know how long you've lived in Clear Lake, but when I first got here, I didn't see people presenting as Muslim 2015, but I sure do now, right? And obviously the easiest way to see somebody who presents as Muslim is that they're wearing a hijab, because it's part of the Jewish tradition too, but Jews in America tend not to wear that. They tend to wear a wig instead of a cloth. We'll talk about that when we get to Judaism. So you may not know that a Jewish lady's wearing a wig, but Orthodox Jewish ladies, they wear wigs. You just didn't know. So anyway, this is changing all the time, and I hate that this is 20 years old. That's just what I got, right? Just to give you maybe a better idea, slide-wise, if this will actually change. Again, here's a lump of Christians, but I would tell you this has probably changed a bit, where Muslims are probably more like 23% now, which would mean Christians would be more like 30%. And that non-religious and atheist label is also probably growing, particularly in Europe and the United States. Oops. Okay, so there you see religions in America. Now this is from 2020. It's from the Pew Research Center, which is a decent research entity, right? And again, what they decided to do is lump everybody in there, whether you're Roman Catholic, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, etc., right? So 80% still identifies as Christian, but as you know, what does that mean? Does that mean you go on Christmas and Easter? Does that mean you never go, but you like to think of yourself, if push came to shove, as Christian? Does that mean you go 5 times a week? I mean, it depends what kind of Christian you are, right? So there's a lot of ambiguity in that self-identification. And you're also seeing, this is really strange, this 1% Muslim. I just don't think that's a great statistic. I think that number is going up, which is part of the reason we need to do things like this, is get our heads around who's in our population and why. You know, again, here's just a little bit of a layout, and it's really interesting. We're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about Judaism, which, if you look at the piece of the pie, is pretty darn small. There's just not very many Jewish people in the world, period. And yet, the reason we spend a lot of time studying Judaism is because the branches of Christianity and Islam come right off of there. And there's quite a bit of Jewish influence in some of the other faith traditions as well. So it can be, you see down there is 14 million. That's probably a high estimate when we talk about what the real metrics of practicing Judaism are. And yet it probably has more influence than some of the big ones on top. Here's this great question for 8th graders. Why do we do this? Now, the number one reason is the bishop school says you have to. I didn't put that in a slide. I think I took that out, right? But one of the reasons, I think, is to understand the human capacity for spiritual transcendence. And sometimes we like to think we've cornered the market on that, and we don't often realize that, frankly, there's other ways of being Christian than we're familiar with that are no less valid. We just don't know what they're like, so we think they must be wrong. I don't know why we have that suspicion as human beings, but it seems like we do. People in the Episcopal Church are a little bit better about this, but in the churches I grew up in, if you didn't do it like we did, it's because you were wrong. So we didn't actually want to understand why you were doing it, because it couldn't be valuable. It might have false value for you. But it is really interesting to think, and particularly when we talk about some, when we think through some of the things that Christians have done. We're not real big on this in the Episcopal Church, but we have them. Anybody have this little string that's got some beads on it, and then there's a cross dangling down off that? Does anybody use that? I'm just curious. Yeah. So we call that a rosary, right? And in the Episcopal tradition, we call them Anglican prayer beads, so that we're saying it's different from a rosary. Now, people who use the rosary, is it valuable for you?
Yes.
And would you be willing to say, like, something it does for you?
For me, it, there's something about the physicality, I think, of holding it.
Yeah.
And going through the beads. It makes me feel peaceful, and the repetition of the prayers
Mhm.
are somewhat, not simplistic, I don't mean it like that, but it makes it easy, it's easy to follow and to, accept that it depends on not to call the decades, but have it, you either do I forget what they want, there are 5 different. The mysteries, thank you.
So Graciela says, it's comforting to have something physiological. It also kind of helps you track where you are in the cycles, right? There is a repetition, which could be monotonous, but also repetition is the way that things get sort of deeper down, right? Anybody else?
Focusing.
It's also focusing, yeah.
It's meditation. It is meditation.
It's meditation, yeah.
Relaxation. Relaxing you.
So does anybody know where the rosary came from?
Oh, gosh, I used to know.
Yeah, it came from Islamic prayer beads. So during the Crusades, right? Crusaders went to Jerusalem and they were there to kill all the infidels. And they saw Muslims going around with this string of beads that has 33 beads on them, because in the Islamic tradition, there's 99 names for Allah, like the merciful, the beautiful, the wise, the strong, sort of like this, right? And it becomes meditative that you cycle through this 3 times in a row and you've hit all 99 names. And the Crusaders looked at that and they said, look at those infidels and their awful, wicked wizardry ways. These are terrible. We should kill them. And their family said, wow, that looks really cool. Like, that looks really helpful. I wish we had that. So guess what they did? They put a cross on it. Now, I don't know if you know where the Muslims got it. The Muslims got it from the Buddhist tradition. And the Buddhists got it from the Hindu tradition. So there's this interesting bit, right, where sometimes we don't realize some of the things we've sanitized, we got from other ideas on purpose, and we changed them a little bit to fit our context. If you want to know, like I kind of am a big vocabulary person when I do this. This is called syncretism, like being in sync. That's when you encounter something in a different thought world and you say, wow, that's so good, I want to bring it in. We do that with language all the time, right? Because many people, when they go to bed, they wear something called pajamas, right? That's a Hindi word. We didn't have that in English. We had night clothes. And then we were like, night clothes, that's clunky. Pajamas sounds good. Let's just do that, right? So we just brought a word right into English because it said more succinctly and more comprehensively something that, well, it was better than what we had. So that's what we did. And this happens in religious traditions too. And sometimes we say that must be a bad thing. But again, in the case of the prayer beads, the rosary, many people find that really, really helpful. I don't know if you know this, the Pope didn't want there to be a rosary. And the Pope didn't have a choice because too many people were using them.
Hey, Mike, what do you mean by spiritual transcendence?
Yeah, I think so. When we talk about transcendence, we're talking about a capacity to kind of be in communion with all and wonder, with something that's deeper than ourselves. So you might have a religion that actually is atheistic, like Theravada Buddhism says there's no deities and there's no like soul. There's an illusion of a soul. And nonetheless, people practice Theravada Buddhism because there is this sense of awe and wonder and communion. So we call that something greater than ourselves, even if it isn't an identified deity. I don't know if that makes sense. So transcendence is a tough word, but I think typically the way mystics do this is they say transcendence is about awe and wonder, and it's sort of about the fragments of the universe kind of having some wholeness and cohesion together. Boy, it sure is great to overcome ignorance about the faiths of others, isn't it? And there's a lot, frankly, of that going around. Like the first time I walked by a Methodist church, this is so sweet. I'm going to tell you this story. You're going to laugh at me. This is great. I was out there, and the Methodist logo looks like Sort of looks like this. It's like a fire.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's the Ku Klux Klan. They're burning crosses. I was 13. I had no idea that was supposed to represent the Holy Spirit on Pentecost. I just had no idea, right? I saw a burning cross, right? So that predisposed me to think Methodists were members of the Ku Klux Klan. By the way, some of them are. Yes, ma'am.
It used to be the Methodist Episcopal Church in America.
It did. It did.
In the
Yeah.
50s, I think it changed to 53.
There's a lot when they united together and became United Methodist Church. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that older than us, and we weren't handed curiosity over them. We were just sort of handed, this is what that is. I would tell you one of the biggest areas of ignorance is that, I'm just going to say this now, and it's okay if you disagree, but that Islam is a violent faith that encourages people to take lives. That is probably one of the most ignorant convictions that entered the American psyche after 9/11 because of what a small, like minutely small group of people politically did who also happened to be Muslim. Most of their own community says they're nuts, right? But it's an interesting thing, particularly when somebody's of a different group doing things we don't like. We don't usually remember there's people in our group doing things we don't like. Like in 9/11, somebody went into an Episcopal church and shot a doctor in the back of the head during a worship service because he gave women abortions when their life was in jeopardy. And that person was sure that God told him to do that, like the Christian God told him to do that. Well, we'd say that guy's just nuts, right? But the people on 9/11, we say that's because they're Muslim. So this is like some fundamental ignorance that is super important for us to overcome, because you can't go somewhere without meeting people of different faith groups. And if you don't think you have, it's because you're not safe for them to tell you. I sure think it's helpful to understand our own culture. Like, I hope you found it interesting that the rosary came from Islamic prayer beads. I hope that's interesting for you. Of course, when we taught this in school, there's no certainty that students are particularly interested in the roots of Shakespeare. I don't know if you know this, people are Shakespearean illiterate since 1980, and now they're largely biblically illiterate as well. And without understanding things like the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible, it's really hard to pick up a piece of Western literature and know what it's really about. But I would also say the same is true for Islamic or Jain or Zoroastrian literature. Most of you haven't even heard of Zoroastrianism. It used to be the biggest religion on the planet, and then it just kind of got wiped out. But it influenced a lot of the Jewish Bible that we still read without us realizing, oh, that was Zoroastrianism. So the history of thought is pretty interesting. It was the religion of the Persians.
Just trying to remember when that was all taken down.
It mostly, we can talk about that as one of these if we decide we want to. Of course, it's important to achieve a global perspective because we don't live in a first, second, third world. We live in one world. I mean, there's one world. And those labels that we use, like, oh, that's a third world country. No, there's just one world. And that world enshrouds us, right? So this is part of understanding, obviously, things like culture and where we live, and hopefully informing our own beliefs and worldview, right? Because a lot of times, again, it's an interesting thing. When you come to the Episcopal Church, particularly the priesthood from a different tradition, you meet people who say, oh, you're new here, but I'm a cradle Episcopalian. I was born on the island. Right? And that's interesting. Yeah. It's a sweet thing to have that be part of your heritage. And people from the outside learned and chose. And so there's room for both, right? There's room for both. And thinking about what choices we make helps inform what choices we continue to make, like kind of on purpose. And I do think appreciation and growth is obviously really, really helpful. And if you didn't mind, I don't want to like spoil where I want to go later, but I do want to mention there's this really important kind of prayer thing that happens from one of the major world religions that Americans have really decided that they love. and they love doing it in hot environments, and they love sweating, and they love the workout without getting hurt, right? So like yoga's all over the place. And what we did when we sort of swept it in, especially now, you can go over to a lot of places that do hot yoga and stretch yoga, is we turned it into exercise. It's all about your body, but we missed it's a spiritual exercise. So like a good yoga teacher will tell you this is not an exercise class. This is a breathing class, also known as this is a prayer class, because in the Hindu tradition, the way you breathe, intentionally or not, is a prayer. Now, I've done hot yoga over a lifetime. It's a great exercise. I can tell you, I was not thinking how I'm communing with all in wonder. I was thinking like, can I stretch harder? This is really uncomfortable. And look, it doesn't have to mean everything in the world, but it could mean more, right? The goal of that is that if you can stay centered in these weird postures, you can stay centered when somebody cuts you off of traffic. So this is tough. What is religion? Now, this is the slide that's really going to scare you, because this is not easy to do. And this isn't so bad. Faith in God, right? This is the thing that we say. Religion's faith in God. But like I said, there are world religions that don't believe in God, like Buddhism. So I don't know if that really works, faith in God. And I don't know if you realize, largely in the United States, people under the age of 40, and even people under the age of 50, like to say, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious.
Yes.
And what they mean by that usually is, I don't attend services, but sure, there could be something bigger than me, right? I don't know how to study that. I'm not even sure what that means myself, because I think that's predicated on a very narrow definition of what religion is. So maybe it's an ultimate concern. I don't like that. I'm building up to the one I like. This one's really something in it. A communication system. I mean, that's interesting. It's got some interesting thoughts. So supernatural beings related to specific patterns of behavior. And this is where we get into things like, oh, there has to be ritual, and there does have to be language. And it's an interesting thing. My mentoring priest said in a sermon one time, I thought this was really bold preaching. He told his story about how he had to go to Sewanee, and at Sewanee in college, you had to take calculus. And after his first year at Sewanee, his grade point average was a 0.5. That's like a 0.5. So his dad sent him to the army. And then when he came back and finished at Sewanee, his grade point average went up because he actually did work. And in taking calculus, which was required, he had no interest. His revelation about calculus was, it's just a language. Calculus is a different language. It's a way of interacting with the world. So he had been thinking about it as formulas in math and not as linguistically. So this is was his kind of epiphany about calculus. And then he said, and that's what we have. That's what we have as a faith tradition. We have a language to give the world, and the world will benefit from this language. It sounded like, well, what about faith in God, ultimate concern? And I don't think he was excluding those. I think he was saying there is some real power to language as a way of relating to experience and community. I still don't think that's the best one. I know, this one's great, isn't it? This is the kind of nerds that you get to read. Like this would have been me. Okay, system of symbols, which establish powerful, pervasive, long-lasting moods and motivations in people by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence. Did I lose you already? Right. Clothing those conceptions with an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. Right. So now you're getting into things like mystery symbols, right? They point to a reality deeper than themselves. They're sort of pointing to transcendence and mystery, and that those things which are not tactily verifiable still seem very, very real. I mean, that's what we talk about when we say faith, right? Faith is a thing we can't always verify empirically, and we trust it to be so. Okay, I mean, that makes sense. That's a long, nerdy way of saying that, right?
I would when you say religion is a system of symbols,
Mhm.
shouldn't you also add and sacred spaces?
Yeah, I think that the word symbol might do that. When I use the word, these are some good ones. Actually, this is wrong. We talk about signs and symbols and sacraments in the church, right? So a sign points to a reality deeper than itself. I mean, think about a road sign. It tells you the name of the street, but it's not the street, right? It represents something bigger than the sign, right? A symbol is an outward sign of an inward reality. Outward sign of an inward reality. We use that in the prayer book, says that about sacrament. Outward sign of an inward and spiritual grace, right? So I've got a different definition for sacrament. I don't know if I want to give that to you now. But it symbol means that, right? It certainly includes spaces. Thin places in the Celtic tradition, thin places, right? That's where the veil between heaven and earth is really, really thin. Most of us see that on like mountaintops or like beautiful oceanscapes. Few of us see those in trash dumps, right? Or we might say that's symbolic for hell, right? I mean, so there's positive and negative spaces, right? And this is in some ways maybe just a deepening of like the language bit. One of my teachers at Emory, his preferred definition for religion is a way of life oriented around ultimate power. I like that one because it's short. It's a way of life, right? And then how we differ is what power is ultimate. And what's interesting to think through is that probably most of us practice a lot of different religions at the same time. Depends on what we say ultimate power is. Is it wealth? Is it friendship? Is it security? So we probably are all multi-religion folk, if you don't mind me saying. If you ask people what is ultimate power, I mean, the right answer is God. And then once we get past the right answer, what is it but really? There might be slightly nuanced differences through the rent. I'm suspicious that's the case, right? Okay, now I just can't help being a nerd. So if you want to glaze your eyes over for 1 second, there's these two religious sociologists, they're both German, and one's called Max Weber, you've probably heard of him, and the other is Ernst Troeltsch, who you probably haven't heard of. And they talk about ways in which religions sort of come and grow, right? And so what they say is, there's basically these progressions. I did this like super awful. Did anybody have to take analogies back when you were in college?
Oh, yeah.
You know, the GRE used to be like 50% analogies, and now they don't even have them anymore because people don't know how to do them. This is true. There's no more analogies. So this is all analogic sets up here, which may be really, really different. So what they kind of say is there's a real big difference between being born into religion and choosing to join it, right? And they say that's the difference between being part of a church and being part of a sect, or being part of a movement and being part of an institution, right? So, look, I was born not Episcopalian, but I was born Christian, right? It would be really different for me to convert to Islam. It would be less different for me to convert to Presbyterian. That's still under the Christian umbrella, right? My kids have grown up Christian without their choice. And I like that. I did it on purpose, right? But when Christianity started, it didn't start like that. Nobody was Christian. Everybody was Jewish or Canaanite or mystery Greek religion or whatever. And then they made these choices, and over time those became institutionalized, and they became even more deeply institutionalized because they raised their kids to do that, right? And we all get, there's a big rub in changing your way of life and what you perceive to be ultimate power. That takes a lot. as a Southern Baptist kid, I could not understand why Muslim people did not want to love Jesus, because that was so clearly the right thing to do. And I'm sure they don't understand why I did not want to be Muslim, because that was clearly the right thing to do. But think about what you lose. When you make a religious conversion, you lose your family and friends, by and large. When you enter a different religion that has different eating habits, like I've got an Orthodox Jewish brother, he cannot eat anything my mother makes. So, like, he doesn't want to leave her behind, and he can't eat anything she makes. Moms or dads who cooked, how would that be if your kids refused to eat anything you made because it wasn't religiously good enough? It would be hard not to take that personal. I mean, don't you think? Yes, it is hard for my mom not to take that personal. Sometimes it's hard for me, right? So these are just some, I don't know that I want to spend a lot of time about this, but I do just want to mention that when we think about how these things grow over time, they usually start out with intentional choices, and people are very mindful. And then there's these structures that get born into us. And that's part of the staying power, right? Ways of life get handed down, and that's good. We choose that. And it's really helpful to know that there's other ways of life that we can appreciate. And again, like I said, some people think this is a bad word. I don't think this is a bad word. I think carefully done, it actually offers us more than what we've got. The bad word, and you probably know this because it gets thrown out a lot, is this word appropriation. Appropriation is when you just take somebody else's stuff without any respect for the context and you say, now it's mine, which is kind of what we did with yoga. I would say yoga was an appropriation, right? Or if you decided like, hey, Native Americans love doing sweat lodges and that's really important, so you're just going to build a sauna in your house and call it a sweat lodge, and maybe like you'll do some drumming before you go in there, even though you have no idea about that. Like that's like kind of the fundamental disrespect of taking somebody else's thing and just owning it and making it yours without appreciating where it came from or what it's doing. There's often a very fine line between those two things, often a very fine line. Okay, so how do I want us to, how do people do this? How do people study other religions? I mean, one way, right, is comparative. So we'd say, well, how do Christian people get married? How do Jewish people get married? How do Muslim people get married? So we could compare and contrast some of the patterns ritualistically, or we could say Jewish people believe in a God that has this particular name that they don't say, and Muslims and Christian people don't think God has a personal name. Or we could say, yeah, look, we've got one God, and you know, Hindus have 33 million gods. Like, so we could just compare like that. But we also have to remember, right, that these aren't always one-to-one comparisons. How many gods do you believe in? Yeah, so thanks for saying that, 3 and 1, because if you're a Jewish person, that's nonsense, right? Which one is it? Is it 1 or is it 3? I mean, most people in the room would say we believe in one God, right? We do. We believe in one God, but we also believe in a Trinity, which makes sense to us. But if you're Muslim, that makes no sense because there's either one or there's more than one. Well, no, it's one. It's just 1 and 3. I mean, that doesn't translate to the Islamic mindset. It doesn't. That just sounds nuts. And I don't know if you know this about Hinduism. Yeah, they're polytheists. They have 33 million gods. But the 33 million gods are really like 3, but those are really just 1. So in some ways, our understanding of the Trinity is more Hindu than it is Jewish. So those are hard to do. Why does religion persist? And how did it get going? And, you know, like we can study like, here's how Islam started. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure you're going to understand how Islam persists. If we just study history, you know anything about the Mormon tradition? Anybody read about Mormon history? It's really weird. And if you just read that history, you might think, why is anybody Mormon? Because it's not based on history alone. It's not. It's based on a way of life around ultimate power. If you know anything about the Mormon tradition, Christians love to pick Other Christians love to pick on Mormons. Can I tell you a Mormon story?
Mhm.
Joe Smith was thrown out of a bunch of different religious traditions because they didn't like him. So one day he was walking in the woods and he tripped over some golden tablets that he couldn't read. So an angel gave him glasses so he could read them, and that's where the Book of Mormon came. And then he pawned off the tablets so that he could make some money, and they couldn't find him later. When you hear that story, you might think that is weird and super bizarre. And yeah, I would tell you, the Mormon religion is the only Christian religion that's growing worldwide every year at a rate of 10% since it started. The only one. And you may say, who could believe in such weird stories? Have you read our Bible? There's like talking donkeys in there. Oh, but they're older stories. They're still crazy. I mean, they're crazy, right? I mean, at surface level, they're nuts, right? And so that's because there's more to this than history and literal reads. I hope I'm making that case okay. Again, we could say cynically, religion started from embellishing people who were just charismatic. Like, did Francis really go around bleeding out of his wrist for 3 years? I mean, that seems like a long time. When you run out of blood, must have been an embellishment. You know that story about George Washington and the cherry tree? It's actually not true at all. But we like it. It's a good story, right? So some people say religions are all about good stories. But look, that's kind of cynical, isn't it? Again, would our own faith withstand that scrutiny? I don't think so, right? So I don't think that's the only way we can do this. Some people say religion's immature science. People just didn't understand weather patterns and they didn't understand astrophysics. So they just said there's a God in the storm clouds and that's why it thunders. Look, I didn't go to meteorology school. My brother did. And I can tell you, he still doesn't understand weather patterns, right? You ever read the weather report here? I mean, that's right, like 40% of the time. And that's the best we've got. In some ways, like, the Clear Lake weather god makes more sense than the weather app, right? So it's interesting to say that early people were ignorant. I think we do that to our own detriment, right? Because like they made the pyramids without iron tools. So again, this is a real cynical thing to think if people just knew what we knew, they wouldn't have religion. This is real Freudian, right? Religion is this like subconscious, it's all about wish fulfillment and expressed needs. And if we just knew how to talk or if we knew ourselves better, we wouldn't need these symbols, which is really weird because if you read Freud, it's like full of symbols. So you know, I want to keep us away from just saying that religion is immature science, or it's just something like psychotherapy, or even like Emil Durkheim, who would say that religion is just a social glue, right? And we need rites to know when we become adults. So let's make them religious, and then they'll have extra power. I mean, I suppose there's some truth to that, but certainly that isn't it.
Could it be that religion kind of helps people to understand the unexplainable?
I would say so, but understand is maybe not, it's not going to be comprehensive, right? I mean, maybe it is to accept that some things are unexplainable.
I mean, I'm thinking about, say, worshiping the sun god. They don't understand the sun, but they come down and does very good things. So there must be something spiritual in it.
I think that one might show up on this part B. I think maybe to your point, right? I'm not sure I understand inspiration. You know, like sometimes we have ideas that are bigger than ourselves. And I mean in a good way, like where did that idea come from? Like that's not my normal thinking. I didn't know that I had that in me. I'm not even sure that's immature silence. I think that's recognition of like, there's something bigger than me at work in the world.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think we have a word like inspiration, which you all hear and you get, because like that's a real thing. You've probably been inspired before to start a new exercise program, or to like call that guy back that normally you wouldn't have, and maybe that went good or bad. I don't know the answer, right? But I think there is some of that. I think there's some of that, right? Because there's some level greater than just biomechanics going on in experience.
And it also could be something that, say, early people would fear something, that could become a god.
That's probably pretty fair, as long as we're willing to admit that we could do that too. I mean, I think, if you don't mind me saying, like I mentioned earlier, there's different religions at work in America beyond like Christianity and Judaism. There are things like American religion, where we worship the nation. I love being a patriot. And there comes a point where it becomes dangerous.
Yes,
I hope you don't mind me saying that.
no,
And we have a lot easier time talking about other countries that do that, like Nazi Germany. Real easy to say that was dangerous nationalism. We don't like to look at what we're doing as dangerous, but the way we're having political debates right now, really dangerous. It doesn't matter what side of the fence you vote on, it's not good. And that's an example of democratic American religion and Republican democratic religion. They're not just ideas, they're ways of life around what we perceive to be ultimate power. And we're not going to have a conversation with heretics and infidels. That's when we get dangerous. So maybe it's some mix of this. I think it's something more. And what I want to say is it's just powerfully complex. So anytime we think we've got all the component parts of religion and that's why we do it, I think we're on shaky ground. Okay, so I don't know if this is good, but I do want to say these are the ways I've kind of put this note sheet together, and the ways that I would maybe like to present at least the first couple to you, right? So one thing that religions have in common are gifted individuals. Now, for example, there's God. God is a gifted individual. Hey, you don't believe in God, there's still Buddha, because Buddha was the first one who found enlightenment. The Hebrew Bible's full of these people. Moses is a gifted individual, and so is Abraham, right? David's got some gifts. Jesus, the apostles, right? Muhammad, peace be upon him. Like these people are gifted individuals. They're part of every religion in the world, even if they don't posit that there are deities. Religions always talk about, in some ways, how you live in community and what, I don't want to say what the rules are, but what community etiquette looks like. And hey, if we observe community etiquette, the community gets better. When we don't do that, it represents a threat to our way of life around ultimate power. So you could call this ethics if you want to, but you could also call this community identity. Every world religion has some kind of sacred story or text that is aimed to give us a coherent worldview. So for us, right, it might be the Bible. If you're an Episcopalian, you might add the Book of Common Prayer into that. You may, right? Does the Apocrypha go in there or not? Depends on what kind of Christian you are, right? If you're Jewish, well, there's the Jewish Bible, but there's also rabbinic commentary called the Talmud, and then there's commentary on the commentary called the Gemara, and then I don't know if this bothers you, sometimes you read the Bible and the beginning of the story has letters A, B, C, D, E, and then in the next verse, you kind of end up at like letter Q, and what happened in between that? So what our Jewish brothers and sisters, they have a book called the Midrash that tells you about all those missing letters. And they get, it's not the Bible, but it sure is fun to know what filled in the gap. And they read that. If you've ever heard about the golem, that's a Jewish midrash. If you've ever heard about Lilith, the first woman, that's a Jewish midrash. Well, it's not in the Bible. No, it isn't. It's in the midrash. And it's a way of helping understand what happened between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, because the creation story gets told twice in a row. Why is that? It's because Lilith messed it up. I mean, so that this is one of those sacred stories of lesser degree. What's the most important part of the Bible? I don't mean what's the right answer. What do you think?
Jesus story.
Yeah, most of us would probably say the Gospels, right? The Gospels. And if you had to read out of the Hebrew Bible, I mean, really, what's the most important part we read out of the Hebrew Bible?
Genesis.
What do we read the most of in church? This is Psalms. We read the most of the Psalms in church. Hey, if you're Jewish, the Psalms are the least important thing in the whole Bible. If you're ever like not sure whether you should read Leviticus or Psalms, you read Leviticus. Y'all would do the other way, I'm pretty sure, because Leviticus is boring, right? I mean, this is kind of what we say. So I just want to say that even though the right answer in church is all scripture is the same, it's all important, it's all inspired, let's be serious. People read the Gospels and they read the Psalms. That's where you go to first, right? So sure, they're all the same, but where do you go when you're not feeling good? Probably that's where you go. Where do you base your decisions on how to retreat women? Well, you could do Paul and you could do this or that, but most Christian people say, let's see what Jesus did, right? So that's a privileging of one part of our scriptures over another. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying we all do it. We all do it. And we have more than just one approach. Every religion's got that. We do have a sense of, it's interesting, what's sacred and what's profane, or the Emil Durkheim is the one who came up with taboo and totem. So totems are the sacred things and the taboos are the profane things. So easy example, whether you're Jewish or Muslim, pork is profane. You don't eat that, right? Is there sacred meat? Not really, there's just profane meat, right? For us, and it depends probably what denomination, you might have a little bit of different understandings of what's sacred and profane, but I think we do all have some sensitivity that there are ways we can profane holy things. We call that like sacrilege or desecration, right? I would tell you, like when I grew up low Protestant, if you weren't careful with the Bible, like if you knocked the Bible off the table, that was like, because you're supposed to show more respect to the Bible than any other book, right? And in our tradition, it might be, if you drop the chalice. One time I spilled a whole chalice of wine right after consecrated it. My alb caught on the corner of the Lord's table and it was everywhere. And I heard it was all over me. Like I was washed in the blood. And so what did we do? We got some paper towels and we cleaned it up and we started over, right? But that thing that nobody thought about that we just did is because like that matters to us, right? Like you don't listen, I don't do it on purpose. We all knew that too. Every religion has got both repetitive and one-time rituals. And so the preferred nomenclature is rites of renewal, things we do over and over again to renew our identity, and rites of passage. So rites of passage, right? They take us from one state of being to a different state of being. Like I was single, now I'm married. Well, you could get divorced, Mike. Well, you could, right? You could, but you got a name change because you used to be single and now you're a wife or a husband. And in some ways, that new identity is irreversible. Well, I'm not married anymore, so I'm single, but identities don't change easily. I mean, they just don't change easily. Words like wife and spouse and father. If my daughter, God forbid, died, I would still be her father. I think that's an irreversible rite of passage, right? So all religions have those things.
What about things, and maybe this isn't appropriate, but I'll ask it. Confession.
Yeah, I can tell you confession, right? How many times can you go to confession in a year?
Oh, well, usually it's and the smartest thing, or maybe the guide is one time.
But
Well,
you can
not
do it
gonna
as
go
many times
anywhere.
as you need to, or as many
Go
times as your
anytime.
priest will see you.
Yeah, you can, as long as the priest is there and you have the right intention.
So that's a rite of renewal. That's a thing you can do over and over again, right? Taking the Eucharist is a rite of renewal. You do it to renew your identity. How many times do you get baptized?
One.
Rite of passage. This may sound a little bit like number 2, but a moral ethical code, right? Things you should do, things you shouldn't do. Almost every religion has some version of the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you want them to do unto you, or maybe it's don't do unto other people as you don't want them doing to you, right? I mean, that shows up Confucianism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism. Well, all of them that I put up on the screen. Okay, that's probably institutionalization. I don't know if I want to talk about that too much more. Inner peace or harmony despite life's challenges. We have a fancy word for that called eschatology. What happens at the end of all things? Well, you go to heaven or you go to hell, right? And this is like some view of eschatology. Or you kind of get absorbed in the global consciousness. That's if you're Hindu. This other idea is like, why do bad things happen to good people? That happens while we're alive, right? Fancy word for that is theodicy. And all religions have to address that because, well, bad things happen to good people. And good things happen to bad people. Of course, all religions love to divide. All of them. Christianity more than any one. Christianity divides more than any 2 denominations, right? But there is at least 3 major kinds of Jews. I mean, more like 4. And then there's a 5th category of non-religious Jews who are called Zionists, right? And that could overlap the other ones. There's at least 2 kinds of Muslims, although I'd tell you there's more than 2. And if you're Hindu, right, there's like 33 million gods. So there's like 33 million ways of being Hindu. So we all got divisions. Sometimes we handle those real well. Sometimes we don't handle them real well. And it's not predictable when that tension's going to come. If you know enough about Islam, the Shiite Sunnite division theoretically goes along fine until it doesn't. Till it doesn't. Like recently, some Iranian pilgrims were going to Mecca because they have to do that. Like they have to do it. And they got trampled in kind of a mass exodus, and the Iranian government said, like, could you explain that to the Saudis? And the Saudis said, you can't come anymore. Like nobody from Iran can go to Mecca. It's not about the politics. It's because in Iran, they're a different branch of Islam than they are in Saudi Arabia. Shiites versus Sunnites, and maybe you've heard those words before, and that gets rolled into politics, but that's the core difference. In general, they get along great, like I said, just till they don't. And then how do we proselyte? Like, how do we get conversions? If you're Jewish, you don't want people converting. This is really interesting. Yeah, we'll talk about Judaism next week is my plan, and we'll talk about a little bit about that. If you're Christian, you want everybody converting. If you're Jewish, you're like, yeah, well, we're just going to do this ourselves. We're good, right? And future hope is eschatology. That's what I was talking about, number 8. Here's what I used to ask my kids at Bishops to do. This is really fun. I'm not asking you to do it, but based on what I just told you, I would have kids make up their own religion. So what they had to do is on one page, they had to do this basic stuff, right? What's the name? What's the origin? What are the main beliefs? And what are the rituals and practices and sacred objects? And what's the benefits you get? And boy, it was super fun. My favorite one was Disney princessism. And the sacred texts, right, are all the Disney movies, right? And those are the gifted individuals, whether it's Belle or Briar Rose or Moana wasn't around then, but you know, that sort of thing, right? And the benefits were you could be a princess yourself. I mean, it was really cute what these kids would come up with. And I know it sounds funny and creative, but the reason I mention it to you is because, as I said earlier, if religion is a way of life around ultimate power, probably most of us in the room belong to more than one, even if we don't want to admit it. There is a gym religion. It's got rituals. And if you don't go, you're like a bad member of the gym religion, right? And you might be an outcast from your fellow gym religion community. I hope you understand what I'm saying. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, but it's also pretty honest, right? It's pretty honest. So it's interesting to think about, like, what else do I see that has a little bit of religious fervor behind it, even if it's not on the list that I showed you. Okay, I don't know if you want these today. You can take them and I'll print some more, but we're obviously not taking much notes today on this. What I wanted to do today, and this is why I didn't want to check at the beginning, is tell you this is kind of what's in my head as a way for framing this out. And what I wanted to do next week is start with Judaism, which I've represented through the Star of David. That's that really unfortunate symbol. We'll talk about that next week. First thing I always want to do is talk about where the name for the religion comes from. Why are Jewish people called Jews, and why the Star of David's here, why that's unfortunate, and then just kind of go down the line and talk about who the sacred individuals are, the gifted individuals, and what's sacred and what's profane, how they do their moral ethical code, what their scriptures are. Maybe not exactly in that order, right? But as a way at the end of like whatever we choose to do here. Look, we might get through Judaism, and you're like, I'm done. Like this was like not what I wanted. Or you may say, well, let's skip Christianity. I'd like to know more about Hinduism. It doesn't make sense to do Buddhism without Hinduism, because that's the origin story, right? Got to do that one first and then Buddhism. But we can essentially go as long as you want. And if I don't know about a thing you're interested in, I'll try to find out. And what we always try to do here of late, last couple of years, is bring in speakers to go visit their places in January. And it occurred to me there's so much interest in that. I mean, we got 60 people going to a Coptic Orthodox church on like a Tuesday night. That's a lot of interest for a little place like us, right? So it occurred to me maybe we'd like to know more. Sometimes we don't even know what questions to ask because we don't know enough, right? And unlike the kids I taught at Bishop's, I didn't get this in school. It was not part of like public school education because we didn't want to teach about religion. And in so doing, we cut ourselves from understanding like how most of the globe perceives the world to be. Not right or wrong, how they perceive just nice to know how people perceive the globe to be. So, okay, that's it for today. That's all I got. Anything you're wondering, somebody asked me, is there a book? And I don't have a book. The reason being, because I haven't found a book that does what I want to do, which is like appreciate why people are doing this stuff. There's a lot of books out there that tell you why they're wrong.
Yes, you could, in your free time.
Oh yeah, let me tell you how well my last book sold, Betty. I think I got a $13 royalty check this year. So I could write it, and I'm not sure anybody would want to buy it or read it. So we'll just talk around this. That's how we'll do it. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure if this is a good question, but I'll just ask it. Why is it that you don't have Catholicism separated, different from, you have all the religions, but Catholicism, because I was raised Catholic, I always think of that as religion as being separate from the rest of the Protestants.
That's a very unfortunate thing that happened after the series of reformations, is that you were Protestant or Catholic, and then what we did in America is you were Catholic or you were Christian.
Oh.
But I think most Catholics think of themselves as both Catholic and Christian. I think so.
Yes.
Right? And it's an interesting thing, again, that most people, Protestant or Catholic, think of the Mormons as Mormons.
Yes.
Mormons think of themselves as Christian, just to be really clear. Like that's their understanding. Well, they're not Christian enough for me. I mean, that's kind of how we ended up doing that. So in those charts I show you, which I didn't make, those came from like the Pew Center, or they came from Gallup or something like that. Sometimes they would split Catholic, Protestant, and sometimes they would just put the main Christian umbrella. Sometimes it's maybe nice to know both at the same time, but I think we do ourselves a real disservice when we don't consider Catholics Christian. I just think that's just,
No.
no Catholic person would appreciate that.
No, that's accurate.
Yeah.
I agree. It's just, I think if you've been raised Catholic, you I don't know how to explain.
Let me tell you what Catholics do better than any other religion. They make people who are Catholic stay Catholic.
Yes.
It is a big deal to not be Catholic anymore. Like, I got lots of people I meet that are like, I pretty much hate the Catholic Church, but what are you gonna do? And like, you could become Methodist. I couldn't do that. But the Methodist Church has everything you believe. Yeah, but I'm Catholic. But you said you don't like the Catholic Church. Yeah, what are you gonna do? I'm like this. I'm not kidding. Catholics, they know how to make you Catholic. Like, they are really good at that. And I don't want to take away from that. We're not good at that in the Episcopal Church. Not anymore. We're not. We're not. We're like, well, as long as you're enjoying it, glad to see you. And when you're done, we get it.
And Northern Ireland, of course, as you know, Catholics and Protestants, big divisions, always will be, as far as I can see.
Yeah.
But what we're told that Catholic means universal. So we as Anglicans were Catholic, but you were Roman Catholic if you were the others.
This is where we get into the language thing, right? This is really interesting. I don't want to waste your time, but I don't know if you've noticed, when we pray for the Catholic Church in the prayer book, sometimes it looks like this. Small c means universal, but I'll tell you, in Rite 1 and in another form of the prayers of the people, they go ahead and capitalize that c. That must mean Roman. No, it doesn't. It just means universal. That's what it means in our prayer book. But it also has become associated with Roman Catholicism. So this is one of these different things where language does become really important in religion. And I don't know if you've been part of different churches before, like I've bounced around some different denominations. We use the same words, but they mean something totally different. And that's where it becomes really, really interesting. Like, Catholic people, Episcopal people, we have basically the same missal, right? It's real similar. But we got real different theology in the Episcopal Church. I don't know if you knew that. Maybe I shouldn't say it's real different. It's different, right? When we talk about the sacrament of marriage, we both talk about that, right? The main reason for marriage in the Catholic tradition is procreation. In the Episcopal tradition, the main reason is unity. Procreation is optional. So when we talk about the sacrament of marriage, we could be using the same words, but we've got really different priorities, at least in the theological tractates, where nerds like me live, right? Just for example, so vocabulary can be part of that, Rob. Yeah.
I
Yes,
see a whole nother series of courses.
Oh, I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
Is it Greek Orthodox? I was curious about that.
Yeah, and that's another weird thing for us, right? Like, a lot of times we say Orthodox, and that means you have the right opinion. But, right, like, I've got real Orthodox theology, but of course there's this like huge part of the world, whether they're Greek or Russian or Syrian, right? There's a lot of different Orthodox churches with a capital O. Yeah, and we very rarely consider those folks, because you don't see a lot of them. There used to be a big Greek Orthodox church in Galveston, but it's kind of gone by the wayside. You ever go to those services, they're like 3 hours long, and they're all in Greek. Which, when we talk about like institutionalization, I mean, it's kind of hard to get converts because you got to learn Greek. I guess a pretty big hurdle, right? And when your kids only learn Greek in church and they don't speak it at home, then they stop to understanding it and they just go. By the way, that's why we had the Reformation, right? Because we were going to Latin and the priests didn't understand it themselves. They were just getting up there and babbling in made up words that they thought sounded like Latin. So we thought we'd better change that, right? Yeah, we'll talk about the Orthodox tradition. It's interesting. Okay. Hey, well, if you're back, I'll see you next week.